On January 1st, 2025, Poland took over the presidency of the Council of the European Union, or EU. It has a single focus: security. In the wake of Putin's vicious war in Ukraine, Poland is making securing the rest of Europe against the Russian threat a priority. But what exactly is Poland going to do between now and June 30th? How does it plan to defend Europe from Russia? And what does Poland bring to the table that makes it unique among Europe's military nations? We get some hints about what Poland intends to do with its EU presidency from Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk's speech upon the country ascending to the role. "Europe is not yet lost as long as we are alive," declared Tusk, paraphrasing words from the Polish national anthem in the process. Poland's prime minister talked about how the continent is pervaded by a sense of loss and a mood of uncertainty as Russia's forces, led by President Vladimir Putin, continue to sacrifice themselves in their thousands to take Ukraine. Tusk also made clear Poland's intention during its presidency. "You know what tasks are important for us now. You will have realized that security is of key import now. Our motto is Secure Europe," the Polish prime minister exclaimed. But Tusk wasn't fear-mongering in this speech. He also told Europeans that it was time to raise their heads and not be fearful. "Europe is and will be great," claimed Tusk, noting that it's a continent of 450 million people, with 27 of its nations being EU member states. Those states are able to work together to reconcile differences so that they can collectively face a common threat: Russia. "Europe is stronger than it perhaps realizes," claimed Tusk in his speech. "We have the same share in the world's GDP, or gross domestic product, as the United States," he said when pointing to the EU's economic power. "When we talk about the threat posed by Russia today, I must tell you that when I hear certain statements, to me it's pathetic that some people in Europe have complexes against the demographic potential or economic potential of Russia. We need to believe again in our power," Tusk exclaimed. The entire speech was filled with this sort of raising up of Europe as a global power capable of confronting the severe risk that Putin's forces propose to the continent. And throughout, Tusk's message was clear: led by Poland, Europe would bolster its security once more to mitigate the threat posed by Russia's marauding leader. The question is simple: how? The Council of the European Union provides some answers. It says that Poland's policies will focus on 7 dimensions of Europe's security, with defense and security being at the forefront. Poland also aims to enact policies that would protect Europe's people and its collective country's borders, and develop systems to resist foreign interference and disinformation campaigns. Ensuring security related to freedom of business is Poland's 4th policy, with the final 3, related to energy, agriculture and health, all also carrying the tinge of security Tusk spoke about in his speech. Again, it's all about making Europe more secure and independent, not only from and against Russia, but potentially from the United States. And that brings us to why Poland's security-first stance matters so much. There are several reasons, with Donald Trump's ascent to the role of US president being among the most important. Back in January 2017, Tusk claimed that he saw Trump as a threat to Europe based on worrying declarations the US president made at the time. He said that Trump had put into question the last 70 years of American foreign policy, likely referring to Trump's repeated criticisms of NATO. By that point, Trump had already called the alliance obsolete and suggested that the US might not defend member states that weren't meeting their financial obligations. His stance sent shockwaves throughout Europe, raising fears that America's commitment to NATO was no longer guaranteed. Division is what Tusk feared most in 2017, and he still fears it today. Poland's prime minister was less direct in his rhetoric relating to the United States in his EU presidency speech, but he couldn't avoid mentioning the country. Trump's backing of Europe is still uncertain. In early February 2025, Trump repeated previous concerns he held about the size of America's trade deficit with the European Union, even going so far as to demand that Europe import more products, including cars and farm products, from the United States. If not, Trump claimed, tariffs would soon be on the horizon. "It will definitely happen with the EU, I can tell you that," Trump said when referring to those tariffs. They will supposedly come pretty soon, with Trump also claiming that the European Union has treated us so terribly. Whether Trump believes these claims is beside the point. He's made them, and Poland, at least, has listened. That's why Tusk is so adamant about security beyond the directly militaristic. Tusk is worried that Trump's policies could impact the EU economically, which would have the knock-on effect of making the bloc's countries less able to spend as needed on their militaries. Combine these issues with the ongoing threat of Trump pulling the United States from NATO, and it becomes even clearer why Poland is taking a security-first approach. In February 2024, former senior US official John Bolton said that NATO would be in real jeopardy if Trump became US president. Bolton served under both Trump and former President Joe Biden, and he made a simple claim: "I think he would try to get out." Trump has said similar things in the past, though always tied to Europe not paying its way within NATO as the caveat. More European countries are now hitting the 2% of GDP target NATO asks of its members. However, not all of them are, and some aren't even close. Of the 23 NATO members that are also EU members, 16 now meet or exceed the 2% target. However, there are 7 who still aren't there, including Italy, Portugal, Spain, Croatia, Belgium, Slovenia, and Luxembourg. In Italy's case, it's increased defense spending, but only from 1.46% to 1.49%. For Trump, that shortfall may be all that's needed for him to pull the US out of NATO. Tusk wants the EU to be prepared for that possibility. He also wants Europe to be prepared for the threat of Russia attacking a NATO nation, which would almost inevitably be a European nation given Russia's location. In Tusk's mind, that attack may already be happening. January 15th saw him accuse Putin and his cronies of planning multiple acts of terrorism against European aircraft. I can only confirm that Russia planned acts of air terror, not just against Poland, but against airlines across the globe, Tusk claimed during a meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Though he didn't elaborate on these claims, Tusk's concerns about Russia are mirrored in other areas of Europe. For instance, the Czech Republic's transport minister, Martin Kupka, said that Russia had made thousands of attempts to attack European railways since Putin started his special military operation in Ukraine. Putin's goal may have been to damage the supply lines running into Ukraine, but these attempts all constitute Russia attacking Europe. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania also have very real concerns about Putin's future ambitions should he succeed in Ukraine. All 3 countries have been teaching more of their citizens to fight since at least early 2024 and have collectively announced plans to build a defensive line that would guard their borders to Belarus and Russia, regardless of the outcome of the Ukraine conflict. That's not surprising. All 3 are former Soviet states, and each would essentially be dangerously vulnerable if Putin completes his special military operation. Their message to Europe was clear at the time and is still clear today. Wake up, it won't stop in Ukraine. Tusk believes the same thing, and when combined with the threat of losing the US as a NATO ally and the economic problems Trump's proposed tariffs could cause for the EU, his messages about security are pertinent. Europe needs to have a security plan, and Poland is going to be at the forefront of executing that plan, at least for the 6 months that it holds the presidency of the Council of the EU. But how does Poland intend to help Europe bolster its defenses against the threats it faces? Interestingly, one of its tactics may be to align Europe with Trump's calls for the continent to spend more on defense. In January 2025, Poland backed claims made by Trump's administration that all NATO countries should be spending 5% of their GDP on defense. That call would more than double the 2% target NATO has in place now, and it received a decidedly mixed reaction from other European countries. Poland saw Trump's claims as an opportunity, with its defense minister Władysław Kozyniak-Kamysz even claiming that Poland could position itself as the transatlantic link between Europe and the Trump administration. However, he said this while exercising some caution. It will take another decade for European countries to reach Trump's proposed spending, said Kozyniak-Kamysz. However, he also claimed that Trump should not be criticized for setting a really ambitious target, because otherwise there will be some countries that will continue to debate whether more spending is really needed. Granted, 5% of GDP is more than any NATO member, including the US and Poland, spends on its military currently. However, Poland is edging closer. In 2024, it spent 4.12% of its GDP on defense, and 2025 brought with it the Polish intention to spend 4.7%. America spent 3.4% of GDP on its military in 2024. You could almost see Poland's agreement with Trump on this issue being a veiled message to the US that it needs to play catch-up with Poland first. But it's also a message to Europe and an indicator of Poland's intentions in its EU presidency. It wants to convince European nations that they need to spend more. Tusk may even see 5% as an unrealistic target, hence the "another decade" comments from his defense minister. But he still believes EU members should increase their spending. Collectively increased defense spending is a good thing for Europe, and Poland will want to encourage it over the remaining months of its presidency. Poland also made some interesting moves before it ascended to the president's role. For instance, Tusk has been building his relationship with French President Emmanuel Macron over the last few years. The two leaders even met in Warsaw in December 2024, where they discussed the possibility of creating a special European peacekeeping force of up to 40,000 soldiers. Macron is a notable potential ally for Poland in its EU security ambitions because it was France's leader who was among the first in Europe to suggest putting boots on the ground in Ukraine. The December 2024 meeting seems to take a similar approach, though it's worth pointing out that this is a French initiative. As Tusk said, Poland isn't planning any such actions. The French president knows this, we discussed it. Any decision on Polish actions will be taken in Warsaw and only in Warsaw, said Tusk in the wake of the meeting. It's also worth noting that the 40,000 soldiers will be a peacekeeping force sent into Ukraine after its war with Russia, with the proposal seeming to indicate that the force would be assembled in the case of a ceasefire. Alternatively, Macron may have Donald Trump's potential peace plan in mind, which some speculate includes the creation of a demilitarized zone between Ukraine and Russia, staffed by European troops. Either way, the result is the same when it comes to Poland's relationship with France. The two countries are in deep discussions about security issues. That suggests there's potential for cooperation in the future, with Poland perhaps being able to rely on France, which is one of the EU's biggest power players, to support its security-first approach. And it's not just France with which Poland is building relationships that have a distinctly defensive-minded approach. Poland has also been strengthening ties with Sweden, and the Baltic nations that we mentioned earlier are already preparing themselves for a potential Russian invasion if Putin succeeds in Ukraine. Scandinavian and Baltic nations have long cooperated on defense. At the beginning of the 1990s, the 5 Nordic nations of Sweden, Finland, Iceland, Denmark, and Norway created the Nordic-Baltic Cooperation Front, or NB8, with the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. The NB8 was initially created to help the Baltic states assert their independence in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse, but it's developed into so much more than that since. In 2010, the NB8 created a Wise Men group designed to help the 8 nations find new ways to cooperate. That cooperation included a focus on defense and has also seen NB8 expand its scope to enable cooperation with friendly nations outside of the main group of 8. How does Poland fit into all of this? At the end of November 2024, Poland and Sweden signed a new security partnership that saw both Tusk and Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson agree that Europe needs to start taking more responsibility for its own defense. Again, that's on brand with the messaging Tusk delivered when Poland assumed the EU presidency. Closer cooperation on EU security and defense in a broad sense is the foundation of the renewed strategic partnership between Sweden and Poland, said Kristersson in the wake of talks between the two leaders. We intend to work jointly to strengthen security in the Baltic Sea region and address the threat that Russia presents. Defense industry also says the discussions between Poland and Sweden included joint preparations for Poland becoming the EU Council's president. By signing the agreement, Poland has signaled its intent to not only work alongside Sweden, but the rest of the NB8 members with which Sweden also cooperates. Combined with Tusk's discussions with Macron, it's clear that Poland is pursuing a cooperative approach in its plans to defend Europe from Russia. It has France on its side. It's now working alongside Sweden and its allies, and with Poland's push to convince European nations to spend more on their defense, we can see that Tusk believes that Europe needs to work together to defy Russia. And don't forget Poland's comments about being the transatlantic link between Europe and the United States. Tusk is trying to use Poland as the intermediary that keeps NATO together and makes the European countries within that organization stronger, all to keep the US on board. But that's not all. Beyond trying to convince Europe to cooperate on defense, Poland has also set itself apart as the country to which all other European nations should aspire when it comes to defense. How? It's become one of the true powerhouses of Europe. We mentioned earlier that Poland intends to raise its defense spending to 4.7% of its GDP in 2025, well over twice the NATO target of 2%. In 2024, it hit 4.12% of its GDP, also double NATO's target. And that translates into a nation that's spending billions to make itself stronger. In 2025, the country's spending will reach around $35 billion, which is more than the Baltic nations and many of the former Soviet nations spend on their militaries combined. It's also spending considerably more than the likes of Italy, with the only thing holding Poland back is that its GDP is lower than some of Europe's more prosperous nations. You could say that Poland is doing as much as it can with what little it has. That's reflected in the size of its military, which has become one of the most powerful that Europe has to offer. Global Firepower, which ranks the world's militaries on their strength using over 60 factors, says that Poland is now 21st out of 145 nations. It has a large active military with 202,100 personnel, backed by around 350,000 reservists and paramilitary forces numbering 50,000. That means the country has around 600,000 military personnel, which is impressive given that its population is just over 38.7 million. Poland has a solid air force with 479 assets, including 44 attack-type planes, which places it 13th in the world in that category. It also has 614 tanks and over 23,000 military vehicles, along with 677 self-propelled artillery units, which is the 7th most in the world. Granted, its navy isn't the strongest, with just 62 assets, but those assets include a pair of frigates and 2 corvettes, which already put it ahead of many navies when it comes to sheer tonnage. Poland also has a heavy focus on mine warfare, with 26 of its vessels being for that purpose, the 3rd most in the world. Stacked against military superpowers like the US and Russia, these numbers may not seem particularly impressive. However, bear Poland's status as a relatively small country in mind. Even with a GDP that's far lower than many other nations, it's built one of Europe's most respectable militaries, and it's not stopping. Poland has identified its navy as a potential weak point and has an expansion plan in place that the International Institute for Strategic Studies, or IISS, says will see it take a step up in capability. We saw that in January 2024 when Poland held a keel-laying ceremony for a new Michnik-class frigate named Orp Witscha. That's a massive upgrade over the second-hand US-made Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigates Poland has used in the past, and it signals the country's intent to make itself a more dangerous presence in the Baltic Sea, a key naval defensive line against a potential Russian invasion. The Michnik-class frigate alone displaces about 3,000 tons more than the older Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigates, showing that Poland is serious about building a strong navy. It's also making moves to turn itself into more of a threat against Russia, as well as to defend itself and Europe from Putin's ambitions. In November 2024, Poland started fortifying its border with Kaliningrad, which is a Russian enclave that's separated from the mainland, along with its border with Belarus. Dubbed the East Shield, this set of border defenses includes new infrastructure, physical barriers such as dragon's teeth to stop incoming tanks, and a surveillance system that will allow Poland to keep an eye on Russia's movements. Then there are nuclear weapons to consider. Poland has no intention of becoming a nuclear-armed state. However, it's made several overtures to NATO that it should be considered as a country that hosts nuclear weapons, especially as a response to Russia moving nukes to Poland's neighbor, Belarus. If there were a decision by our allies to deploy nuclear weapons within the nuclear sharing also on our territory in order to strengthen the security of NATO's eastern flank, we are ready, Poland's President Andrzej Duda said in April 2024. Poland may not have those nuclear weapons yet, however it's made clear its desire to have them as part of its approach to bolstering Europe's security. That's what Poland's internal strengthening comes down to. It's made itself a European power player, both to defend its allies and to better make its case for cooperation and further European investment into defense now that it holds the EU presidency. There's just one small wrinkle in all of these plans. Poland's own presidential elections will take place during its time at the head of the EU table. Those elections, which take place in May 2025, promise to make or break Tusk's role as prime minister. That's because Duda, despite agreeing with Tusk on the possibility of Poland hosting nuclear weapons, often opposes Tusk in Polish politics. Duda has even used his presidential veto to block several of Tusk's pro-European coalition party's policies in the past. Tusk will be hoping that May brings with it a president that aligns with his party, allowing Poland to project a more united front as it positions itself as one of the leaders in Europe's defensive ambitions. There's a possibility that will happen. Rafał Trzaskowski, who is Tusk's favored candidate and was only narrowly beaten by Duda in Poland's last presidential elections, is the current frontrunner. He faces competition from Karol Nawrocki of the more nationalistic PiS party, of which Duda is also a member. A victory for Nawrocki could mean more blockages of Tusk's pro-European policies, which would impact Poland's ability to properly lead Europe in defense against Russia. Still, Poland is making some interesting moves when it comes to bolstering Europe's security. The question now is whether Europe will follow Poland in spending more and actively cooperating to mitigate the Russian threat. What do you think about how effective Poland will be in the presidency of the Council of the EU? Will it succeed in making Europe stronger, or is much of the continent still failing to grasp the true danger that Putin poses? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and thank you as always for watching the video.